There's something in the woods that doesn't belong, something too quiet, too smart, and too strong. Trails go cold in seconds, tents are ripped apart without a sound, and seasoned hunters vanish as if they were never there. Whatever it is leaves behind massive footprints, twisted branches 10 feet high, and a heavy silence that settles deep in your bones. Locals won't talk about it, not really. They just warn you to stay out after dark, never go alone, and if you hear heavy breathing near your camp, don't move. It's already watching. Staff Sergeant Clayton Reese had always embodied resilience throughout his 15-year career with the United States Marine Corps. His commanding officers described him as unshakable, the type of soldier who maintained his composure even in the most harrowing combat situations. In August 2014, Reese was deployed with a small reconnaissance squad to a national forest in southwestern Oregon that extended into California for a specialized 10-day endurance training exercise. The location had been selected specifically for its challenging topography, dense forest cover, and isolation, perfect for testing the limits of even seasoned Marines. The wilderness area had a long history of strange occurrences that locals rarely discussed with outsiders. Native tribes had traditionally avoided certain sections of the forest, particularly during winter months, though authorities dismissed these cultural taboos as mere superstition. The region was officially known for its black bear and mountain lion populations, with rangers occasionally fielding reports of unusually large wildlife sightings that they attributed to exaggeration by startled hikers. By the 5th day of the exercise, Reese had established his base camp in a small clearing approximately 14 miles from the nearest access road. He had been methodically mapping the surrounding ridge systems when the first unusual incidents began. That evening, as darkness settled over the forest, strange knocking sounds echoed through the hills, repetitive and unnervingly rhythmic. Reese documented in his field journal that he initially dismissed these as woodpeckers, or perhaps branches knocking together in the wind. However, he noted there had been no significant breeze that night. The following morning, Reese awoke to discover his meticulously organized supplies scattered across the campsite. His rations had been torn open, the water containers were empty, and the equipment had been tossed several yards from its original position. Most disturbing were the ground indentations surrounding his tent, massive, shapeless depressions that suggested something of extraordinary weight had circled his shelter repeatedly throughout the night. Despite his extensive wilderness training, Reese could not identify what creature might have caused such markings without leaving distinct tracks. The Marine reported later that he had spent the day rebuilding his camp and securing his remaining supplies, but was unable to radio for extraction due to training protocols. He noted in his journal that an oppressive silence had fallen over the forest. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. The stillness, he wrote, felt deliberate and watchful. On the 7th night, while collecting water from a nearby stream at dusk, Reese encountered what would ultimately end his military career. Through a gap in the trees, approximately 50 yards away, he observed an enormous bipedal figure covered in dark, matted hair. According to his subsequent report to Captain Dale Mitchelson, the creature stood easily 11 feet tall, with shoulders twice the width of a large man. Most chilling was the fact that it held a half-snapped pine log in one hand, a tree that would have required tremendous strength to break. Reese described how the creature locked eyes with him for several seconds. The eyes, he noted, appeared disturbingly human in their intelligence, but radiated unmistakable hostility. Breaking from his frozen state, Reese had slowly backed away before turning to sprint through the thicket toward his camp. The dense undergrowth lacerated his face and arms as he ran, but he reported being driven by an overwhelming primal fear unlike anything he had experienced in combat. He abandoned his camp and spent the night in a hastily constructed shelter 20 feet up a sturdy pine tree. Throughout that night, Reese documented hearing powerful growls, wood-breaking sounds, and heavy bipedal footsteps circling below his position until dawn. The noises had eventually subsided, but he remained in the tree until midday before cautiously descending. When the extraction team located him 2 days later, they found Reese visibly shaken. He filed an official report describing a possible encounter with an unusually aggressive bear, However, in a private debriefing with Captain Mitchelson, he adamantly insisted that what he had encountered was no bear, nor any known animal. The creature had moved with deliberate intelligence and seemed to understand how to provoke fear. 1 month after returning to base, Reese submitted his resignation papers, ending a distinguished 15-year military career. Despite his commanding officer's attempts to dissuade him, his decision remained firm. He relocated to a small town in Montana, where he established a wilderness safety consultancy firm that specifically advised clients to avoid certain densely forested regions. According to former colleagues who maintained contact, Reese refused to enter forests thereafter, conducting his business exclusively from urban offices. When pressed about his experience, he would only comment that some things in the wilderness were beyond military preparation and best left undisturbed. Forest rangers who later inspected the area found Reese's campsite completely demolished, with equipment scattered across nearly half an acre. They officially attributed the damage to black bears, despite the unusual height of branch breakages and lack of characteristic bear markings. The section of the National Forest in southwestern Oregon where the incident occurred was quietly removed from military training rotation the following year. The Kaisuse Reserve had long been considered one of Slovakia's most pristine wilderness areas, spanning thousands of hectares of virtually untouched forest along the Czech border. Local folklore spoke of strange occurrences within its deepest valleys, areas where woodcutters refused to venture after sunset. Despite these tales, the reserve remained a prized hunting ground, particularly during winter, when tracks in the snow made it easier to locate the game. In February 1996, 3 experienced Slovak hunters, Radomír Varga, Ivan Gregor, and Dusan Prikril, embarked on what was intended to be their annual 10-day hunting expedition in the reserve. The 3 men had been friends since childhood and had hunted together for over 20 years, specializing in tracking wild boar. Weather reports indicated heavy snowfall was coming, but the conditions were precisely what made boar hunting productive in these remote areas. The trio had established a well-equipped base camp approximately 18 kilometers from the nearest access road, in a secluded valley known to locals as Ticha Dolina, Silent Valley. According to the expedition plan they had filed with local rangers, they intended to set up satellite camps further into the reserve over the following days. Experienced foresters, they carried proper supplies, emergency equipment, and had established regular radio check-in times with a friend in the nearby village of Chadka. When they missed their 3rd scheduled radio contact, their friend initially assumed it was due to equipment failure caused by the harsh weather conditions. By the 5th day of silence, he alerted authorities. A search operation was organized but delayed by a severe snowstorm that had descended upon the region. On the evening of the 6th day after their last contact, a highway patrol officer discovered Dusan Prikril walking barefoot along the snow-covered road leading to Chadka. According to the official report, Prikril was suffering from severe frostbite on both feet, exhibited signs of extreme dehydration, and appeared to be in a profound state of psychological shock. Most disturbing was the fact that his hunting clothes were saturated with blood that forensic testing would later confirm belonged to both his companions. Medical personnel who treated Prikril at the regional hospital in Žilina reported that he remained virtually catatonic for nearly 48 hours. When he finally began to speak, his statements were fragmented and initially dismissed as hallucinations resulting from trauma and exposure. He repeatedly mumbled about something waiting for them and watching from the trees. Using the coordinates Prikril eventually provided, a search and rescue team located their camp 3 days later. What they discovered defied conventional explanation. The tent had been torn apart from above, with the fabric shredded in a manner inconsistent with any known patterns of wildlife attacks. More chilling were the claw marks gouged into surrounding trees at heights of 3 to 10 feet off the ground, far higher than any regional predator could reach. The remains of Radomír Varga and Ivan Gregor were discovered approximately 30 meters from the camp. According to the confidential forensic report that was later leaked to regional media, both bodies exhibited catastrophic blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by an object of immense weight and force. More disturbing was the fact that the bodies appeared to have been deliberately arranged, placed back to back in a seated position against a large pine tree. Several items of their equipment had been methodically put in a circle surrounding them. Official statements from the QUITS Forest Authority attributed the deaths to an attack by a rogue brown bear, possibly disturbed from hibernation by the hunters. This explanation was publicly challenged by the Slovak Hunters Association, whose representatives pointed out that bears neither arranged bodies nor created the distinctive patterned claw marks found at the scene. The marks, they noted, appeared to have been made by a creature with 5 digits rather than a bear's 4-toed paw. Regional Police Captain Miroslav Janotic initially pursued a thorough investigation, but was reassigned 3 weeks into the case. His replacement quickly closed the inquiry, classifying it as an animal attack, with unusual features attributable to scavenger activity. Several pieces of evidence, including hair samples and plaster casts of unusual prints found near the site, were reportedly lost during transfer between departments. Dusan Prikryl was released from psychiatric care after 6 weeks, but never returned to his former life. He moved to a small apartment in Bratislava, far from the forests of his homeland, and refused all interview requests from journalists and researchers. His wife later revealed to a local newspaper that in their private conversations, Dusan had described something walking upright through the snowstorm that had been waiting for them. He reportedly told her that he had only survived because it wanted someone to tell the story. Most notably, he mentioned that whatever attacked his friends had eyes that reflected their flashlight beams, like mirrors filled with human hatred. To this day, older residents near the QUITS Reserve warn visitors not to venture too deeply into certain valleys. Particularly after heavy snowfall, they speak in hushed tones about the bieli tien, white shadow, that hunters occasionally glimpse moving between trees at twilight. A massive, pale figure that leaves no tracks in fresh snow despite its evident weight. Park authorities dismiss these accounts as embellishments of the tragic 1996 incident, but have nonetheless restricted overnight camping in the area where the attack occurred. Dusan Prikryl died of heart failure in 2011, never having set foot in a forest again. His widow reported that in his final years, he slept only during daylight hours, claiming that darkness brought the sound of something scratching at their windows, something he insisted was still looking for him after all those years. The Khao Thong rainforest sprawled across Thailand's southern peninsula, a relatively undeveloped wilderness area that had only recently begun appearing in backpacker guides. The forest was known among locals for its exceptional biodiversity, ancient limestone caves, and the occasional tiger sighting in its most remote sections. Unlike the country's more popular national parks, Khao Thong remained largely unmarked by tourist infrastructure, appealing primarily to adventurous hikers seeking authentic wilderness experiences. Local communities surrounding the forest held complex beliefs about the area. Village elders in nearby Bang Nam spoke of places where the forest spirits were particularly active, warning that certain valleys and waterways should be approached with offerings and respect. These traditional perspectives were largely dismissed by authorities managing the region's emerging ecotourism initiatives, who emphasized the scientific importance of the forest's rare flora and fauna instead. In July 2007, 26-year-old Derek Hughes arrived in Thailand as part of a year-long backpacking journey through Southeast Asia. A recent university graduate from Manchester with a degree in environmental science, Hughes had developed a reputation on backpacker forums for venturing into less traveled areas and documenting his experiences in vivid detail. His online posts revealed his intention to explore Khao Thong's interior, despite warnings from expatriates about the area's challenging terrain and limited cell service. Hughes began his solo expedition on July 12th, having obtained the necessary permits from the local ranger station. He planned a 5-day circuit through the forest, carrying basic camping equipment, water purification tools, and a satellite GPS device that allowed him to post brief updates to an online travel forum. His early messages described spectacular biodiversity, including rare butterflies and unusual primate behavior that he couldn't identify in his field guides. The tone of his updates shifted noticeably on the third day. Hughes reported unusual night sounds that he initially attributed to macaques or gibbons, although he noted they seemed deliberate in their pattern. His final post, time-stamped at around 8:42 p.m. on July 14th, simply read, "Something in the camp perimeter. Not animal movement. More tomorrow if signal." No further updates appeared. When Hughes failed to check in at the ranger station on his scheduled exit date, local authorities initiated search protocols. The search party, composed of park rangers, police officers, and several expatriate volunteers familiar with the forest, used Hughes's GPS coordinates to locate his last known position. What they discovered at the campsite left even experienced rangers visibly shaken. According to official reports, Hughes's tent had been destroyed, not merely collapsed but shredded into strips, with the aluminum support poles bent at angles that suggested application of tremendous force. His backpack had been torn to ribbons, its contents scattered across a 20-meter radius. Most puzzling was the food bag Hughes had properly suspended from a tree branch to deter wildlife. It hung untouched approximately 5 meters above ground, still securely knotted. Ranger Somchai Thamasak documented unusual markings on surrounding vegetation. Vertical claw marks ran up several banana trees and strangler figs, beginning at heights of over 2 meters and extending upward. The spacing and depth of these markings were inconsistent with those of known regional wildlife, including sun bears and clouded leopards, native to the area. 3 days into the search operation, volunteer Timothy Blackwood discovered a waterproof plastic bag wedged between exposed tree roots approximately half a kilometer from the campsite. Inside was Hughes's journal, with entries continuing beyond his final online update. The final pages described his growing unease about being watched by something that moved primarily in the canopy above his camp. The last entry, partially smudged by moisture despite the bag's protection, contained Hughes's description of hearing heavy breathing directly outside his tent on the night of July 14th. He wrote that the sound was unmistakably not simian and noted a powerful odor of decomposition and musk that permeated the air. His final words in the journal read, "Something's been following me for 2 nights. I thought it was a monkey. It's not. It's bigger. I heard it breathe behind my tent." The search continued for 11 more days before being officially suspended. No trace of Hughes's body was ever recovered, despite extensive grid searches of the surrounding area. Thai authorities classified the case as a probable wildlife attack, suggesting that a disoriented sun bear or possibly a tiger had encountered the camper. The official report noted that heavy monsoon rains during the search period had likely obscured crucial evidence. British consular officials pressed for further investigation, commissioning an independent assessment from wildlife biologist Dr. Eleanor Farnsworth. Her unpublished report, later leaked to regional researchers, concluded that the damage to the campsite was inconsistent with the behavior of any known predator. She particularly noted the selective destruction of Hughes's possessions. Certain items appeared to be deliberately targeted, while others remained untouched, suggesting intelligence rather than animal behavior. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from local Moken fishermen who assisted in the early search efforts. They refused to enter certain sections of the forest, claiming that the area was home to a creature they called Phai Kong Koi, a forest spirit said to walk upright on one leg and emit cries resembling those of a human infant. According to their tradition, the entity was known to fixate on solitary travelers who disturbed its territory. 6 months after Hughes's disappearance, a German tourist reported finding a hiking boot matching the brand Hughes had been wearing, lodged in a tree crevice nearly 20 meters above ground level. Park officials declined to investigate further, maintaining that the case had been conclusively attributed to wildlife. The hiking boot was never officially added to the case file. To this day, the Khao Thong rainforest remains a destination for adventurous backpackers, though ranger stations now strictly enforce a no-solo hiking policy and require all overnight visitors to carry emergency beacons. Local guides refuse to discuss Hughes's case with tourists. However, they routinely make offerings at certain forest crossroads before leading groups into the interior, a practice they describe simply as respect for the forest's true residents. The Black Forest had always held a place of dark reverence in German folklore, its dense evergreen canopy and mist-shrouded valleys giving rise to countless tales of supernatural entities. The Schwarzwald-Bachwald sector was one of the forest's most remote regions, located approximately 32 kilometers from the village of Hornberg. Despite its isolation, the area contained valuable old-growth timber that had attracted commercial logging operations since the mid-1970s. In November 1981, a 14-man logging crew led by veteran foreman Klaus Hesse established a seasonal camp in the sector to fulfill a 3-month winter cutting contract. The location had been specifically selected for its untouched stands of mature spruce and pine, though local forestry officials had noted the curious absence of wildlife in the immediate vicinity. The team constructed 5 prefabricated cabins to serve as sleeping quarters, a mess hall, equipment storage, and an administrative office, standard accommodations for extended forestry operations in the region. Hesse, who had worked in the Black Forest for over 23 years, later reported that the crew had noticed unusual atmospheric conditions from their arrival. Even on clear days, a persistent ground mist clung to the forest floor, and sound seemed to travel oddly through the trees. Normal conversation was sometimes inaudible at short distances, while distant chainsaw work echoed with unnatural clarity. Several workers commented on the unusual silence. The expected ravens, woodpeckers, and small mammals common to the Black Forest were noticeably absent. The first concrete incident occurred approximately 2 weeks into the operation. Workers arriving at the cutting zone discovered that several chainsaws and fuel canisters had vanished overnight from the locked equipment shed. The heavy steel padlock remained secured, showing no signs of tampering. More puzzling were the deep impressions found in the mud surrounding the structure, asymmetrical depressions measuring approximately 60 centimeters across that could not be readily identified as belonging to any known forest wildlife. Hesse documented the theft in his daily log and attributed the strange prints to frost heave, which had affected the ground. He instituted additional security measures, including night patrols conducted by off-shift workers. 3 nights later, the scheduled patrol reported hearing rhythmic knocking sounds from the ridge above the camp, described as wooden impacts with deliberate timing that continued for nearly 40 minutes before abruptly ceasing. The following morning, workers discovered more of the unusual impressions, this time leading directly between the trees and stopping at the edge of their clearing. According to camp cook Dieter Zimmermann, the tracks appeared to have been made by something of extraordinary weight as they sank nearly 15 centimeters into the frozen ground. Hesse ordered the men to work in pairs and restricted movement around the camp after sunset. On the 17th night of the operation, Hans Fechter, a 34-year-old equipment operator from Frankfurt, left the main cabin to use the separate latrine facility approximately 40 meters from the sleeping quarters. When he failed to return after 20 minutes, several workers went to search for him. They discovered his boots and flashlight on the path, but no other trace of Fechter himself. Most disturbing was the condition of the surrounding forest edge. Branches had been broken at heights of 3 to 4 meters, with the splintered ends pointing toward the deeper woods. The crew immediately contacted forestry authorities and police in Hornberg via radio. Due to heavy snowfall that night, official investigators could not reach the remote site until the following afternoon. Their subsequent search extended 5 kilometers in all directions, but yielded no sign of Fechter. The official report noted only that unusual damage to the tree canopy suggested a possible localized weather phenomenon that might have caused the missing worker to become disoriented. Morale among the remaining crew deteriorated rapidly. Hesse instituted a strict buddy system and suspended night operations entirely. Workers reported difficulty sleeping due to what several described as movement sounds in the forest canopy surrounding the camp. Heavy branches creaking under substantial weight that seemed to circle the clearing throughout the night. 2 nights after Fechter's disappearance, the crew was awakened shortly after 2 a.m. by what multiple witnesses described as a high-pitched, wavering scream unlike any known animal call. The sound appeared to originate from directly above the equipment storage hut. When workers emerged from their cabins, they discovered that the structure had been severely damaged, Its roof beams had collapsed inward, as though subjected to enormous pressure from above. Several tools were found embedded in trees at heights impossible to reach without specialized equipment. According to Hesse's final report, it was at this point that all the remaining workers unanimously decided to terminate the operation. Despite contractual penalties and the loss of substantial wages, the entire crew packed essential equipment and departed the site on foot at first light, refusing to wait for scheduled transportation. They navigated the 20-kilometer forest trail to the nearest road, maintaining formation and refusing to separate, despite the difficult terrain. Regional forestry officials investigated the abandoned site 3 days later and found the camp largely intact, but they documented several anomalies. These included a collapsed storage hut, scattered equipment, and a series of large, unidentified impressions that led from the camp perimeter into the deeper forest. The tracks, according to official reports, extended approximately 300 meters before disappearing at a rocky outcropping. Investigators attributed the damage to seasonal ground freezing combined with wildlife activity, possibly wild boar. The logging company attempted to establish a new crew at the site in January 1982, but failed to recruit sufficient workers willing to take the assignment. The Schwarzwald-Bachwald sector was subsequently reclassified as a research-only forest preserve, effectively ending commercial operations in the area. Klaus Hesse never returned to forestry work following the incident. In a 1983 interview with a regional newspaper, he acknowledged only that there are sections of the Black Forest where humans are not welcome. When pressed about the specifics of what he had witnessed, Hesse reportedly stated that on the final night, while the others were packing, he had observed something standing motionless at the forest edge, a massive silhouette against the trees that he initially mistook for a peculiarly shaped pine. It was only when the form shifted position, still maintaining perfect stillness of its limbs, that he realized he was looking at something that defied conventional explanation. The Mau Forest Complex stood as East Africa's largest indigenous montane forest, a sprawling ecosystem covering over 270,000 hectares across Kenya's western highlands. For centuries, local communities had considered certain sections of the forest sacred, with the Ogiek and Maasai peoples maintaining traditional prohibitions against entering specific valleys and ridges. Colonial authorities had dismissed these beliefs as superstition, but ecological surveys consistently noted unusual wildlife distribution patterns in these forbidden zones, areas where even typical forest creatures seemed conspicuously absent. By the early 2000s, the Mau had developed a modest ecotourism industry, with guided expeditions focusing primarily on birdwatching and botanical photography. The forest's outer regions were considered safe and accessible, while its inner parts remained largely unexplored, except by research teams and experienced guides. In September 2002, veteran wildlife guide Peter Kiprono was leading a 6-person photo tourism group along the forest's northeastern boundary. Kiprono had established a reputation over 15 years as one of Kenya's most knowledgeable forest guides, having grown up in a village adjacent to the Mau and completed formal training in wildlife management at a university in Nairobi. The expedition consisted of 4 European photographers specializing in rare orchid species and 2 local Maasai porters who carried the group's equipment. The team had established their base camp in a small clearing approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest access road. The location offered spectacular views of the forest canopy stretching across deep valleys, with the distinctive silhouette of the Mau escarpment visible in the distance. According to Kiprono's expedition log, the first 3 days proceeded without incident, with the group documenting several rare plant species and observing typical forest wildlife. On the 4th afternoon, one of the porters, a young Maasai man named Lentillo, returned to camp visibly agitated after collecting water from a nearby stream. He reported to Kiprono that while filling containers, he had observed what appeared to be a man covered in hair, watching him from a rocky outcropping, approximately 60 meters up the adjacent cliff face. Most disturbing was his insistence that the figure had remained perfectly motionless except for its head, which had tracked his movements with unsettling precision. Kiprono, concerned but skeptical, asked Senior Ranger David Arup Rotich to accompany him to investigate the location. The two men documented their findings in a joint report that was later submitted to the Kenya Wildlife Service. At the stream, they discovered a series of deeply impressed footprints along the muddy bank, prints far too large and deeply sunk to have been made by a human. Most puzzling was their orientation, which suggested a bipedal creature of extraordinary weight. Following the prints away from the water, Kiprono and Rotich tracked them to a dense stand of bamboo, approximately 200 meters from camp. The trail ended abruptly at a section where multiple mature bamboo stalks had been snapped at heights of over 3 meters, damage inconsistent with any known regional wildlife, including elephants, which typically pushed bamboo aside rather than breaking it cleanly. Near this location, they recovered several tufts of coarse black hair caught on the splintered bamboo. Kiprono collected these samples in a plastic container, intending to have them analyzed upon return to Nairobi. That night, the expedition members were awakened shortly after midnight by what multiple witnesses later described as an extraordinary vocalization emanating from the direction where Kiprono and Rotich had investigated earlier. The sound began as a low, rumbling growl that rapidly ascended to a piercing scream, a sound that Kiprono would later describe as part human, part animal, but wholly terrifying. The vocalization continued for approximately 45 seconds before abruptly ceasing. The effect on the expedition was immediate. Two of the European photographers demanded emergency evacuation at first light, willing to forfeit their substantial tour fees. The Maasai porters refused to leave the immediate vicinity of the campfire, explaining to Kiprono that they recognized the sound as belonging to a creature their elders called Naimina Nkiyo, a forest entity traditionally believed to guard sacred groves against human intrusion. Despite the tension, Kiprono convinced the remaining expedition members to continue for one more day, though he modified their planned route to avoid the bamboo thicket. The following morning, he and Rotich returned to the site of their previous investigation. What they discovered effectively ended the expedition. In a small ravine approximately 300 meters from the bamboo stand, they found an area of forest floor that had been systematically flattened, branches broken and vegetation compressed into a circular depression approximately 3 meters in diameter. The arrangement strongly resembled a crude nest structure, with materials deliberately positioned to form a central depression. Surrounding trees showed evidence of recent damage, with bark stripped at heights of 2 to 3 meters above ground level. Most concerning were the fresh tracks leading away from the nest site, the same distinctive impressions they had observed previously, but now forming a clear path heading directly toward the expedition's camp. Scattered throughout the area, they collected additional hair samples and discovered several broken branches that appeared to have been snapped deliberately rather than falling naturally. Upon returning to camp, Kiprono decided to terminate the expedition immediately. The group packed essential equipment and began hiking toward the forest access road, leaving their heavy gear to be retrieved later. Local Kenya Wildlife Service authorities were contacted via radio and met the group at the forest boundary, where they documented their account of the events. The official investigation that followed attributed the incidents to leopard activity, citing the predator's known habit of dragging kills into trees and their powerful vocalizations. Park officials suggested that the unusual tracks were likely elephant footprints distorted by recent rainfall. The hair samples collected by Kiprono were reportedly sent to a government laboratory in Nairobi, but the results were never publicly released. Peter Kiprono continued working as a guide for several more years, but conspicuously avoided assignments in the Mau forest, preferring instead to lead safaris in the open savanna regions. In a private conversation with environmental journalist Wangari Muthoni in 2007, he admitted that the Mau incident represented the only time in his career when he had felt genuinely hunted. He described an overwhelming sense that whatever had created those tracks had been assessing the expedition members, learning their patterns, and preparing to act. David Arap Rotich left the Kenya Wildlife Service the following year and established a cultural tourism business focusing on Maasai traditions, operations that kept him far from the deep forest. When occasionally questioned by colleagues about the Mau incident, He would only respond that some aspects of traditional Maasai beliefs deserved greater respect than modern authorities were willing to give them. The section of the Mau forest where the incident occurred was later designated a restricted research zone, ostensibly to protect rare plant species. Local guides, however, noted that government rangers rarely ventured into the area, particularly after sunset. Occasional reports of unusual vocalizations and bipedal figures glimpsed at forest edges continued to emerge from nearby communities, though wildlife authorities officially acknowledged none. Peter Kiprono eventually left his guiding career entirely, establishing a roadside souvenir shop near Nakuru that catered to tourists traveling between national parks. When asked about his career change, he would simply explain that he had seen enough of the wild places, particularly those parts of the forest where humans were merely visitors rather than welcome guests. The borderlands between Argentina and Chile run through some of South America's most forbidding terrain, jagged peaks, hidden valleys, and ancient forests that remained largely unexplored until the modern era. Local inhabitants of the region, primarily indigenous Mapuche communities, maintained complex spiritual beliefs about these mountains, designating certain areas as cursed lands, where strange phenomena had been reported for generations. One such location, a remote valley approximately 17 kilometers from the nearest settlement, was known among locals as El Silencio, the silence, due to the unnatural absence of wildlife sounds that characterized the area. In July 1989, during the austral winter, a joint military exercise between Argentine and Chilean special forces was conducted in this border region. The operation, codenamed Condor Blanco, was designed to test cold weather survival techniques and border security protocols. 58 soldiers participated, divided into small squads that navigated independently through designated sectors, maintaining radio contact with a central command post established in a former mining facility. Private Luis Herrera, a 23-year-old communications specialist from Cordoba, had been assigned to Squadron 4, a 6-man reconnaissance unit tasked with mapping a particularly remote section of the border. Military records indicated that Herrera had excelled in previous mountain training exercises and was considered exceptionally reliable by his commanding officers. Squadron 4 had established their temporary base camp in a sheltered ravine approximately 22 kilometers from the command post, at an elevation of 3,100 meters. According to the official incident report, the events leading to Herrera's disappearance began on the evening of July 17th. The squad leader, Lieutenant Javier Morales, had instructed Herrera to conduct a routine perimeter check, while the other members prepared the evening meal and set up the communications equipment. The standard protocol required these checks to be completed before full darkness, with personnel maintaining radio contact throughout the process. Herrera began his patrol at approximately 5:40 p.m., maintaining regular radio checks every 10 minutes as required. The transmissions were routine until 6:20 p.m., when Herrera's voice reportedly changed. Lieutenant Morales documented that Herrera's final radio communication consisted of rapid, agitated speech. The transcript recorded his last words as, "¿Quién está allí? Eso no es humano." Who's there? That's not human. The transmission ended with what witnesses described as a sharp intake of breath followed by static. Lieutenant Morales immediately dispatched 2 soldiers to Herrera's last reported position, approximately 300 meters northeast of the camp. When they failed to locate him after 20 minutes, Morales initiated emergency protocols, notifying command headquarters and organizing a systematic search pattern with light equipment. Despite deteriorating weather conditions, the search continued for 3 hours before being suspended due to heavy snowfall and temperatures dropping to below minus 15 degrees Celsius. At first light the following morning, reinforcements arrived from the main command post, bringing the search team to 26 personnel. Military helicopters were requested, but were unable to deploy due to severe wind conditions in the mountain passes. The search grid was expanded to cover a 5-kilometer radius from Herrera's last known coordinates. Approximately 36 hours after Herrera's disappearance, a Chilean sergeant named Miguel Ortega made a disturbing discovery. Herrera's military-issue radio was found suspended from a tree branch, approximately 4 meters above ground level. The antenna was entangled in smaller branches, as though it had been deliberately placed there. Most strange was the fact that the device was still operational and transmitting an open channel of static. Technical specialists later confirmed that the radio's battery should have depleted within 12 hours of continuous use, raising questions about how it remained powered. Near this discovery, search teams documented several anomalies. The snow beneath the tree showed massive depressions approximately 70 centimeters in diameter and 15 centimeters deep, arranged in what appeared to be a bipedal walking pattern. Most disconcerting was the distance between these impressions, nearly 2 meters apart, suggesting a stride length impossible for a normal human. The impressions led to a rocky outcropping where they abruptly disappeared. Several pine trees surrounding the area exhibited unusual damage, with branches broken at heights of 3 to 5 meters above ground level. The pattern of breakage suggested a downward force of extraordinary magnitude, rather than damage from wind or snow accumulation. Despite extensive searching, no other trace of Herrera was discovered. No clothing, equipment, or blood evidence in the snow. The official search continued for 11 days before being classified as a recovery operation rather than a rescue mission. Military authorities expanded their efforts to include local police and mountain rescue specialists, who covered more than 30 square kilometers of surrounding terrain. Despite this exhaustive effort, no further evidence of Herrera's fate was uncovered. The Argentine military's final report attributed Herrera's disappearance to disorientation followed by exposure, suggesting he had become lost during deteriorating weather conditions and fallen into one of the many deep ravines that characterized the region. The report proposed that the unusual placement of the radio and the strange impressions in the snow were the result of extreme weather conditions affecting normal patterns of evidence preservation. This explanation failed to satisfy 2 senior officers who had participated in the search. Captain Ernesto Dominguez and Major Rafael Quintana submitted a confidential supplementary report, questioning several aspects of the official conclusion. They noted that Herrera had been equipped with cold weather survival gear sufficient for 72 hours in sub-zero conditions and carried emergency signaling equipment that was never activated. More significantly, they questioned how a disoriented soldier could have placed his radio 4 meters above ground level in a tree. Their report included interviews with 3 local Mapuche guides who had assisted in the search. The guides had refused to enter certain areas of the search grid, explaining that their people traditionally avoided the region. They spoke of legends regarding tall, hirsute creatures that patrolled the high mountain valleys, entities they called El Trauco, forest spirits that were said to abduct solitary travelers. The supplementary report was classified and never incorporated into the official record. Following the incident, the specific valley where Herrera disappeared was removed from military training maps and redesignated as a restricted conservation zone for environmental purposes, effectively prohibiting future expeditions. The rationale cited sensitive alpine ecology rather than safety concerns. Luis Herrera's family continued to press for information for several years, eventually securing a meeting with a retired colonel who had overseen the original investigation. According to family members, the officer advised them to accept the official explanation and suggested that some things in the mountains are better left uninvestigated. The Herrera case remained technically open but inactive in military records, classified as a training casualty with unrecovered remains. In a curious postscript to the incident, the zone known as El Silencio was formally incorporated into a new national park in 1997, with strict regulations that prohibited overnight stays and required all hikers to register with rangers before entering the area. Park authorities cited environmental preservation as the justification, but local guides noted that ranger patrols consistently avoided certain valleys within the park boundaries, particularly during winter months when the strange impressions were most likely to appear in fresh snow.